Alrighty, in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be basically wrapping up our CLI. We have our commands working, we have our type coercion working, we have a really nice little kind of skeleton, oops, wrong project. We kind of have this nice little skeleton going on here with our command line interface. It doesn't do a whole lot, there's not a whole lot of code, but it's fairly well tested, and it is going to serve us well in the future when we start extending it. But basically, the thing that we don't have implemented yet that I really want to implement is going to be our command objects. So like our test commands object that allows us to write our commands in terms of classes and methods in a very, very nice sort of straightforward way. So what I want to do here is I want to go ahead and implement that. It's not actually going to be that scary. It's pretty easy to do now that we have everything else figured out. However, I do want to go ahead and throw in a test here, or one more test here, I guess, and that is I want to test my CLI name attribute. So before we move forward, I want to throw in one more test that uses the CLI name attribute. So what does the CLI name attribute do? Well, it overrides the name of the class or the methods. Basically, it allows us to, instead of this test commands class having a group name of test commands and a command name of command 1, we'll be able to override that with the CLI name attribute. So what I want to do is I want to write another test commands class. So I'm going to say public class test commands 2, and I'm not going to worry about doing any sort of fancy parameter checking or anything like that, but I am going to go ahead and give it a CLI name attribute of test-commands-2. Then we're going to have a public int command1 call count with a public getter and a private setter. Then we're going to have a public void command1 method, which simply increments command1 call count. And we're going to give him a CLI name of command-1. So I want to make sure that the CLI name attribute works for both our classes and our methods. And of course, this is going to necessitate us to write one more test. So let's scroll down. I'm going to write this test after the two tests at the top that are currently failing. Say public void CLI name attribute overrides command or class and command names. Make sure we give it, or make sure we put the test attribute on top of it. Then I'm going to say var CLI equals new command line interface. I'm going to say var test commands equals new test commands 2, in this case, not the other test commands. Then I'm going to say CLI.register command object, simple closure, and we'll hoist up the test commands local variable. Then I'm going to say CLI.execute, passing in a new string array of test-commands-2 with a command name of test-command or command-1, I believe was the, let me check that real fast. Yeah, it's command-1. And then finally, I'm going to say test commands dot command1 call count should be 1. All right, so that's really the last thing that I want to do there. Let's go ahead and run this test, make sure it fails, which it does, which is what we expect. So a nice little compact test testing our CLI name attribute. All right, let's go ahead and something weird with my test window. I'm going to say run all on that to reset it. There we go. Okay, so let's jump back into our Solution Explorer and let's get implementing. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to write a convenience method, a convenience extension method that will allow us to easily extract a custom attribute out of a method name or a class member. Or sorry, wow. Out of a class or a method. So you guys, I hope you guys have had some experience with reflection. Basically, with reflection, it'll be possible for me to see what attributes are attached to this class. But the syntax to do so is a little unwieldy, particularly because it was written in .NET 1 before generics. I want to write a extension method that will make it very easy to extract single custom attributes from a method or from a class. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up my extensions namespace in my MMO base infrastructure extensions namespace and jump into my reflections extensions file. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to say public static t. I'm going to write two of these methods. Public static t get single custom attribute t. This member info that bool inherit equals false, where t is an attribute. Now, by adding this extension method to member info, this will allow us to use this extension method on things like methods and classes and interfaces and all that fun stuff. So what does this method look like? Well, it's going to be pretty simple. It's going to be simply return that dot get custom attribute type of t inherit dot of type t dot single or default. I'm going to write another one of these methods. It's going to look almost identical. It's going to have the same name, get single custom attribute. It's going to have the same, almost the same signature, except for it's going to have a parameter info that bool inherit equals false, where t inherits from attribute. And the body of this method is going to look the exact same as the body of the method above. The reason why we need both is because parameter info is used for method parameters, and member infos are used for types and methods and stuff. So they're two different inheritance hierarchies. They're actually not related to each other at all. Even though they look very similar, the parameter info and the method info, they're not. So you have to do that. Anyway, so now that we have both of these methods written, we have a very convenient way of writing out what would be really ugly code really simply. Alright, so let's jump into our command line interface class and go ahead and implement our register command object. So our register command object, the first thing I want to do is I want to extract the name of the class that we're registering. So I'm going to say var type name attribute equals type of t dot get single custom attribute. Of course, that brought in a using statement at the top. Of type CLI name attribute. Then I'm going to say type name equals type name attribute equals null question mark on type of t dot name or type name attribute dot name. So what's going on here? Well, we're seeing if the CLI name attribute is on the type. If it is, then we use what was specified in the attribute. If it isn't, we default to the name of the class. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through every method on that class. I'm going to say for each var method in type of t dot get methods, binding flags instance and binding flags public. So go through every instance public method on this class, and you'll notice we did get an import up there for system.reflection. Now I'm going to say var method name attribute equals, you guessed it, method.get single custom attribute CLI name attribute, and then var method name equals method name attribute equals null question mark on method dot name colon on method name attribute dot name. And then I'm simply going to say var command equals new method command. We're going to pass in the method info, which is simply method. Method info was acquired through the for each loop up here because that's what the get methods method returns. For this, so for the instance factory, now I could pass in, well, I can't pass in instance factory. This is going to throw an error. I can't pass in the instance factory that was passed into the register command object method. Why not? It's because the instance factory that's passed in here has a generic type parameter as its return value. However, the method name or method command constructor expects a function that returns an untyped object. Now, there won't be any way for us to, without introducing a lot of ugly code, to make it so that this could receive a generic type parameter. In fact, it's considerably much faster and more straightforward to do what I'm about to do here. So instead of passing in the instance factory, we're simply going to wrap the instance factory in a new lambda. So I'm going to say open up parameter list lambda. Then I'm going to make sure to invoke the instance factory. So we're basically wrapping our lambda so that we don't have to worry about wrapping our lambda, so we're basically changing the return type of the function, of the delegate. We're changing the return type of the delegate from something that's potentially more derived to something that's less derived. And by doing that, we are able to have everything work without having to do any more nasty reflection-y stuff. Okay, what's the last thing we got to do? Well, the last thing we got to do is register the command. The group is going to be the type name, the name is going to be the method name, and the command is going to be the command. All right, that's about it for that. One more thing. This instance factory, make sure that you invoke it, because you could certainly do that. This is valid code. We could write a lambda that returns the instance factory delegate, but that isn't what we want. We want to write a lambda that returns the result of invoking the instance factory. So we want to make sure that we add in those parentheses. By adding in those parentheses, we're invoking the instance factory method and returning it back into whenever the method command decides to invoke that method or that delegate. All right, so that's about it for that. Let's jump into our method command. Now, our method command is pretty straightforward. We're going to have two private fields, a private read-only method info method, and a private read-only func object instance factory. These are simply going to be assigned to the parameters of the constructor. However, there's one more thing we got to do. We have to figure out the parameters of this method, because remember, we need to be able to describe the parameters that this command takes so that the command line interface class can do the proper type coercion. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say var parameters. Let's see here. Equals method.get parameters, derp. Let's go ahead and loop over this. It's an array, so be sure to do parameters.length, not parameters.count, because this is an array. Then I'm going to say var parameter equals parameters at I. Then I'm going to say var name attribute equals parameter dot get single custom attribute CLI name attribute. Notice that the system reflection or the extensions import appeared at the top. Then I'm going to say var name equals name attribute equals null question mark parameter dot name colon name attribute dot name. And then finally, I'm going to say parameters or parameter list dot add new command parameter dot parameter type followed by the name of the parameter and the order of the parameter, which is simply going to be the index variable. All right, now let's go ahead and implement our internal execute. This is really straightforward. It's simply going to be method.invoke. For the object instance, I'm going to pass in an invocation of instance factory. Then for the parameters, I'm going to pass in arguments.toArray. And that invokes the method. So that is our method command. It's simply a command that acts like a method. Okay, there's one more thing I want to do here. I want to go ahead and, because I totally forgot that I wanted to be able to also have parameters be renamed with the CLI name attribute, I want to go ahead and in the CLI name attributes class itself, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to change my attribute usage to include parameters. So I'm going to say or attribute targets dot parameter. so that we can actually apply this attribute to parameters now. Otherwise, applying this attribute to a parameter would result in a compiler error. All right, let's go ahead and run all of our tests and see what happens. And we get a pass. So now we have a rudimentary CLI. And that's super exciting. So in the next video, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be creating our tools project, our project that's actually going to be invoking our code generator and is going to be triggered by performing a build, and it'll take advantage of the CLI that we just put together. So we'll see you guys in the next video.